Hello, I'm Dr. James Gilley, and this is American National Government. In this module, which is our final module, we're going to be examining America's role in the rest of the world. Right? America is one country, but it exists within a larger global context. So within this module, we're going to examine some theories that hold within our foreign policy making decision groups, as well as examining how that foreign policy decision making apparatus functions. So let's just go ahead, dive right on in. This will be a little bit more of a theory heavy module, but we're just going to go ahead and spend a little time looking at those theories because probably more than in any other module that we've looked at, any other element of America's politics, right? This is perhaps the most theoretically driven area, right? And there might be some ideology that gets baked into some other parts of the policy-making process in our institutions, but actual political theory plays a much larger role in international relations. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. So what we see here is almost the very basic introduction to three major theories of international politics. But before we can really dig into realism, idealism, and liberalism, we need to lay out just a few definitions to make sure that we're all kind of using the same terms in the same sorts of ways. So the first, really the three major terms we need to understand for this particular lesson and to understand how foreign policy is dealt with, we need to look at these three terms. So you'll see them in the upper right-hand corner over there. I guess that's left-hand corner. All right. So the first definition we need to look at is anarchy. Right? Anarchy is something that plays a large role in international relations. This concept of anarchy really means an overarching system with no overriding authority, right? No one to enforce agreements within the system. Now, this anarchy can take a whole lot of different forms. It can look a lot different depending on which theory you're building off of. But in its purest form, and the way that we're going to treat anarchy is almost a neutral style of anarchy, where it's just a system where there's no one sitting over the system to enforce agreements. Building off of that, right? There's also this question of power. Right? Trying to figure out the definition of power is a very tricky sort of thing. We've spent a large deal of time in academia, in international relations, trying to figure out what power really is. What we've discovered, right, what we've figured out is that really at its core, and this is going to be the definition that we're using here, is that power is the ability to make somebody do something they don't want to do or they wouldn't otherwise do. Now, the way this power plays out can vary massively depending on the actors, the system. But at its core, power is simply the ability to make someone else do what they wouldn't normally want to do. So that's power for us for right now. Right? And if you want to know more about that, want to dig into that more, take the international relations course that I offer. That'd be kind of where we really deal with this. But there are other courses that would dig deeper into this question of power. Finally, there's the question of security. Right? Security is almost the inverse of power. Right? It's almost the shield version as opposed to the hammer version of power. Right? So shield, the security element here. What security means is the ability to not be forced to do things you don't want to do. So the way that security works is very tied to the same kind of means of power, but it's much more of a defensive sort of thing as opposed to an offensive sort of thing. So these three major terms and concerns find themselves wedded to or embedded within the theories we're going to be examining. So these theories that we're talking about, these three major theories of international relations, are realism, idealism, and liberalism. Now, these three particular ways of looking at the international system have played a large role in right, really how presidents and their foreign policy groups make decisions in the international system. Each one of these has had major adherents who are presidents, although really, right, one of these is largely discredited at this point. So we're really kind of just down to two of them as major players. But historically, all three of these have played a major role. So let's start by looking at realism as a theory, right? So realism is really kind of the oldest way we have of understanding the international system. All the way back to the days of ancient Greece and ancient China, right? The Warring States period in China. Right? We see this ideology really emerge in two separate places around the same time. So in Greece, we see Thucydides, right? The person who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. Really the first secular, would probably be the best way of saying it, historian. If you've played the new Assassin's Creed Origins game, right, you've met Thucydides, right? You've played out part of this Peloponnesian War. But what Thucydides is doing is seeing how humans themselves interact based on power and power relationships in the system to really see how war and international relations play out. Right, Sun Tzu is also kind of doing similar things with his Art of War, right? So both of these are kind of the original thinkers in the realist framework, and this theory has been around for about 3,000 years. It's gone through some revisions, some formalization, right? Really after World War One, Hans Morgenthau, in an attempt to understand why World War II broke out, sought to codify and regularize and make really predictable and studyable hypotheses about realism. So what he came up with are the 3 points that you see over there. The first is that there is an anarchic world system, right? Within our world system, anarchy reigns, right? There is no overriding authority to enforce agreements to make people behave in certain sort of ways. So what you end up with under a realist conception of anarchy, I like to think of it like Mad Max, right? People riding through the desert, right? Going to the gas town or the bullet farm or whatever. Explosions, fire everywhere. Punk rock music, right? Bass guitarists in front of on a car, right? With giant speakers blaring, heavy metal and punk music. Right? That's kind of the realist anarchy, right? It's a dog eat dog, a very zero sum style of anarchy, right? There's going to be winners and losers within this system. And power is going to really be at the core of this kind of anarchy, right? People with power are going to be much more privileged within this system. Because, number 2, states are the primary and really only actors in the system. And they're also unitary actors, meaning that whatever's going on inside the state doesn't matter. You can imagine all the states in the international system as if they are basically billiard balls, right? Kind of bouncing off of each other, right? They all kind of seek the same thing, which is number 3. All states want to increase their own power within the system. So all states are going to want the exact same thing, and that is to increase their own power within the system. So we really see that, right, because there's no one to tell them what they can and can't do in this system, and everyone wants more power, they're going to really just seek to have more power and be concerned with absolute, well, actually more about relative gains, right? They're concerned about what everyone else is doing. This creates a very paranoid type of worldview. This is a system where power is really the only thing that's mattering. And all states are going to act the same. Some states are going to be like bowling balls on that table. Some states are going to be like little bitty golf balls getting rolled over by the big bowling balls. So you can basically think of the world as this kind of billiard table, right? A pool table with different size balls, but they're all basically single actors, right? Knocking into each other on the international system. And this, right, this is a very popular view of the international system. This is a very popular theory in foreign policy circles. A lot of foreign policy practitioners within the system, they're going to hold to realism as the way that they understand how the international system works. So realism ends up kind of being a dog-eat-dog, paranoid sort of world, and this ends up being a popular view of the international system. Secondly, right, And this is the one that ends up being discredited, right? There's idealism. This was really heavily important for Woodrow Wilson, right? President Wilson, who, interestingly enough, was a political science professor before he became a senator and then a president. He used to work at the University of Virginia. He taught political science, which is kind of a dangerous thing, right? This is one of those kind of like Doc G has interesting things to say. Don't elect political scientists. We have ideas. We have theories about how the world should work and want to try to put them into practice. And that can actually be extraordinarily dangerous, right? What idealism was all about was this notion that people and countries and the entire system can be made to be perfect. They can be forced to be better by creating rules-based systems. Right? It has a defined end goal of essentially ending war and making peace be right prosperous, right? And that all states are going to want to work towards that. Right? So this led to the Treaty of Versailles in very direct sorts of ways. Right? Woodrow Wilson sought to bring forth his 14 points of perpetual peace, which in large part calls World War II. Right? The way that World War I was ended and handled, right? The end of that war, the way that was handled, ends up essentially creating the situation of World War II, and that was a problem. So largely speaking, you don't see many idealists running around in foreign policy circles or within academia at this point. So it's pretty much a discredited ideology. I just wanted to mention it because of Woodrow Wilson's push for idealism and how idealism was really a major way of describing the world up until World War II. And then after that, it's largely discredited. We don't see it emerge anymore. So that leads us with the other major functional theory about the international system, and that's going to be liberalism. Now, it's called liberalism. We could also probably call it institutionalism. But what this is all about is, right, continuing the ideas of the Enlightenment, right, that Enlightenment tradition about creating a international system in an attempt to better govern and, right, end up at a better goal. It kind of looks like idealism, but it has some fundamentally different assumptions that lead to much more neutral outcomes, might be the best way of saying it. So there's three major assumptions we can look at for liberalism as well. It actually keeps the anarchic world system assumption from realism. But this anarchy is a different kind of anarchy. Instead of an anarchy that is predicated on, right, paranoia, dog-eat-dog, conflict, what we see instead is an anarchy that is based on no one telling you what you can and can't do. So you don't have to fight each other. You can work together with other people to achieve the goals that you want. So you're free to build institutions. And what we see is that institutions are important because they allow for, right, what we call regularized interactions. And the more that you work with people, right, the better you get to know them, the more you trust them, and eventually, right, the more peaceful your interactions with them become. So within the anarchic world system of liberalism, right, this is really right, almost like a libertarian style of anarchy, right? An anarchy where you're free to do what you want to do, to work with whoever you want to work with, to treat people how you want to be treated yourself. So this is a much more neutral version of anarchy. Secondly, right, and this is where we really start to diverge from realism. We see that there are actually many different actors within the international system. It's not just states that matter, right? Non-state actors matter, right? Multi-state actors. So anything, right? Individuals matter, right? So the United Nations is important in the system. NATO is important in the system. The European Union is important in the system. Amnesty International matters, right? Elon Musk has a role to play, right? So really, right? Al-Qaeda, ISIS, right? There are many different kinds of actors within the system. It's not just about nation states, right? And right, that's one of the problems that realism has, is it can't account for the actions of non-state actors. Particularly over the last 20 years, we've seen terrorism be a very important issue on the international system, but realism really doesn't handle terrorism very well, right? It just assumes power, and that's really not a lot of what terrorist goals are. So we see that, right, many types of actors can emerge within this system. And additionally, right, number three, they don't all want power, right? Their goals are internally determined by the actors themselves. They're not these billiard balls that you can't, right? The internal politics don't matter. The internal politics very much are important within the liberal system, right? Because they generate the goals that are wanted by actors. So you might some states might still want to increase their own power. Some states might prefer security. Some states might want economic power. Some states might want their people to be happy. Some actors might want representation, right? There are a wide variety of things that can be wanted at their goals within the international system. So liberalism accounts for that much more heavily. So, right, really what we kind of see is this fundamental tension between the realists in foreign policy and the liberals within foreign policy, and right, their opinions on what is the most important thing. Right, realism, we could probably actually call that powerism or something along those lines, whereas liberals are much more about institutions and self-generated goals. But they both have their adherence within the international system and American foreign policy. So they both matter, right? Those are really important theories that legitimately drive actions within the system, right? Every foreign policy group, right? Every president has to essentially pick what they believe about the international system, and they probably are going to pick between realism and liberalism. Now, those theories are the primary drivers within this system, but there are also some other considerations about action within the system that we really need to talk about, and those are the ones that are listed right above me. So the first question is whether or not we should act, right? Should the United States play a role in the international system? For most of American history, the answer to that question was no. We were explicitly an isolationist country, right? If you look at the United States on a map, right, to our north we have Canada as our neighbors. They're very peaceful. To the south we have Mexico, who we get along with extraordinarily well. I'm recording this on Cinco de Mayo, right? We have, right, friendly relationships with Mexico as well. So we have friends to the north and the south. To our east and our west, we have giant oceans. So we are in large part able to essentially sit out the squabbles of the rest of the world if we so choose. And we so chose for most of our history. For about 200 years of our history, that's what we did. Up until World War I, we stayed out of other people's business. But on the other hand of that, right, we are a large, powerful country. And we have a major role to play within the international system if we choose to do that. So you'll see this tension between tendencies for Americans and America to isolate itself from the rest of the world. But you'll also see pushes for America to be heavily involved in the international system, right? So that's kind of the first question, is whether or not America should act in the international system. Right? Kind of the second choice is, how are we going to act, right? Who are we acting with? Right? You see a lot of tendency towards what we call unilateralism, which is we're big and strong and we can do this on our own. But then there's multilateralism, where we want to get together with our friends, our allies, and work together to solve problems. Right? So, are we going to act? How are we going to act? Are we going to do it by ourselves and with our friends? When are we going to act? Right? Are we going to act before things become a problem? Right? That's called preemption. Or are we going to only act after we've been provoked, after we've been attacked? Right? That's a really complex question. It's not one I have a good answer for. Right? I've done a lot of reading on this myself. I've done a lot of thinking, and I don't have a good opinion either way. Right? There's a good argument to be made either way. Right? If someone's about to attack you, right, you have a right to defend yourself and stop them from hurting you. But on the other hand, right, if you are the person that strikes first, then you were actually the aggressor, right? Right. So there's right. It's almost like if you're at a bar and you end up right there's someone giving you the stink eye and you know they're going to hit you. Do you hit them first, or because you hit them first, right, you were actually the jerk, and right, what's the right way to go there, right? That's a really important question in foreign policy, right? Do we have the right to defend ourselves even though we haven't been attacked? Legally, we probably do, right? And within the idea of just war, right? Is it a good war, right? Preemption is a thing, but I don't know, right? There's just this notion of the non-aggression principle, right? We shouldn't be the first aggressor. right? Don't never throw the first punch, but always throw the last punch. But I really don't have a good answer to that. I'm kind of of two minds, as you can see on this one. So, should we act? How should we act? When should we act? And in what way should we act? Right. This is the final question of hard power, which is largely speaking military power. Right. Should we blow stuff up and kill people, or should we try to persuade using our culture and our economics to get people to do what we would want them to do? Both of those are legitimate. Both of those are large elements of our foreign policy, both hard power and soft power. So, right, but we've got some serious considerations to be made about action within the international system. So let's move on and think about the kind of issues that we actually act upon, right? Where we act. So what we see here is a list of 8 major global issues that, right, are the Pentagon, right, the entire foreign policy world agrees these are big things that we are going to have to deal with as a global community, and these are issues that are, right, kind of, right, these are like the top 8, right, like old school MySpace. This is your top 8 of foreign policy problems, and in no, right, this is no particular order. These are just kind of those top 8 important foreign policy issues. So the first one we're going to talk about is climate change, right? This is, right, even the Pentagon admits that, right, that the way that the climate is changing, this really fundamentally affects kind of power relationships between states, right? And this is an inherently global problem that needs to be addressed in global sorts of ways. So this is going to be right, both a diplomacy issue, but this could very well become a defense issue as well, right? Dealing with, right, changing climates and how that changes geopolitical boundaries, how that changes flows of people, economic issues, right? This is a major problem moving forward. Secondly, we have the question of weapons of mass destruction and their proliferation, right? As these things, right, as these really deadly weapons, right, kind of flow between borders, how do we make sure they don't get in the hands of bad actors? And as technology increases, and perhaps making it even easier for these weapons to proliferate, how do you stop that, right? How do you keep really dangerous people or non-state actors even from getting their hands on weapons that could do massive amounts of damage within the international system? Which is kind of tied into the next question of terrorism, right? Terrorism has been around for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. But we've entered into what we call this war on terror, this ill-defined war on terror that makes it extraordinarily difficult to win, right? But terrorism doesn't seem to be going away because it's always been around. This isn't a new thing. But how we deal with this in the international system is, right, it's a really important issue. Of course, you have classic issues of geopolitics as well, right? States wanting to control land, right, and wield their power to control land and populations. This is kind of the classical international relations issue, right? That's what Clausewitz was writing about hundreds of years ago, right? It's still a very relevant political issue on the international system. It's something we have to deal with. Right? Russia influencing the countries around it, China, right, trying to play a larger role. All of these play into classical geopolitical issues. Economics are still very important as well, right? Trade wars are a thing, right, that we engage in, right? Just general trade issues and flow of goods and people and ideas across borders, right? This is, right, it's a global issue, right? We have built up an economy that is very heavily integrated in an international sort of way. Now, we've had this before, and we've broken it down, thrown up trade barriers previously, right? That's what was happening in the run-up to World War I and afterwards, right, with World War, really in the run-up to World War II as well. Right? So for a 30-year period, right, we broke down our international global economy, and that's a possibility of something that could happen again. So, right, fundamental economic issues, right? If one country's economy goes down, right, it's quite likely to bring down everyone else's. So our economies have become so heavily integrated, we have to treat economics and trade as fundamentally global issues. We still have stability in the Middle East, right? Instability in the Middle East is a huge thing, right? Even though ISIS has pretty much been beaten back, the caliphate as a geopolitical entity doesn't really exist. Uh, right, there are still major problems in the Middle East. Right, it's an unstable region. Right, the Arab Spring exposed a lot of the problems that were there. Right, we see Iran and Saudi Arabia engaged in essentially a Cold War that they're kind of playing out in Yemen. So there's a lot of instability there, right? We still have issues between Israel, Palestine, as well. Syria is in a massive civil war that's caused a major immigration crisis. The Middle East is still a fundamental geopolitical region. Uh, I've got a sneeze building up, and it's going to happen. It's going to end up being a rogue sneeze. I just apologize in advance for when that thing comes through. Alternatively, we also have the problem with China, right? China is a sleeping but waking giant with massive, right? The world's second largest economy, one of the largest militaries. It wants to be a geopolitical player. It's throwing its weight around in Africa, South America. It's really and Central Europe as well, right? So, well, sorry, Central Asia. Well, even starting to play a role in Europe too, to a degree. So China as a political player is really important in how we're going to manage China's rise. And do they buy into the institution we've already created, or do they want to set up their own institutions? And what that means about hegemony and major geopolitical issues, that matters, right? That's a big problem, right? Big opportunity, big problem that is emerging. So we've got to keep an eye on China, all right, and how they're dealing with their own internal problems as well. And then kind of just an overarching issue that we've seen emerge as well is that this notion of democracy and international institutions and liberalism is really being kind of fundamentally undermined even within the West, right? The people, right? We see these populist movements emerge and what that means about, right, all these countries, how they traditionally deal with each other. If that breaks down, what does that mean, right? Is it worth defending these institutions? Are these institutions good institutions? Are they representing people? Is the nation state itself still a good model? Right? All of these are still very fundamental issues that impact really global geopolitics. There's also things like immigration is a major global issue. Technology, right? The creation and management of new technologies and how that disrupts society. Those play huge roles as well. Right? That'd be kind of giving us a top 10. So how do we actually deal with this stuff, right? How have we set up our institutions to deal with these major foreign policy issues? Well, we have this foreign policy apparatus, right? That's really kind of siloed into two different sides, but these two sides very heavily interact with each other. They intermesh with each other, right? They don't exist on their own. They're almost like a carrot and a stick, but they're very heavily integrated. So on the one hand, right, as we see over on that side, we have what we think of as our defense wing, right? What's predicated on what we call the National Security Council. Now, this National Security Council are kind of top level, right, executive officers working together to help the president make decisions about foreign policy issues. Now, it's not always this exact cast of characters. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's fewer, right? Sometimes, right, different players play a larger role or a smaller role within the National Security Council. But these are kind of the 6 or 7 major players that do sit on it, right? We see the Secretary of State. We also see the Secretary of Defense. We see the UN ambassador play a role. Obviously, the president. The vice president typically is involved as well. The National Security Advisor, who is, right, kind of the president's pocket academic who knows things about foreign policy and about understanding how the international system works, as well as the intelligence czar, or the Director of National Intelligence, right, the person who runs the CIA and our overall intelligence apparatus. All right, so these kind of 6 or 7 people really make up kind of the core decision-making group when it comes to foreign policy decisions. And underneath them, right, we have various apparatuses, but the two major ones we need to talk about are the intelligence side of things and the defense side of things. So our intelligence agencies, right, the people that gather information and try to help the decision makers, right, have a clear picture of what's going on. There's actually 23 of these things, right, including the CIA, the National Intelligence, the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the National Geographic Intelligence Agency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in having this many, well, really spy organizations, right, this creates a major interagency communication problem, right? These agencies, right, they're made up of spies. And what spies want at their core is to keep their information for themselves, right? It's kind of a counterintelligence sort of thing. They want to hold on to their information, right? They've cultivated their own assets. They don't want to inherently spread their information, right? Spread their intelligence. So there are a lot of problems in getting these agencies to coordinate with each other. Now, theoretically, we have, right, the Director of National Intelligence, the head of the CIA, sitting on top of this, who's supposed to coordinate between all these different intelligence organizations. But that's not always how it works out, right? Particularly when there are major differences in institutional culture. Right? The CIA, it's usually kind of more philosophy, academic sorts of people, whereas the FBI, right, they're more like cops. Right? Cops and professors really don't typically get along all that great, right, just at an institutional level. So getting all these agencies to work together is really hard to do. And that's created a lot of problems within our system. Now, we have attempted to reform our intelligence capacity here in the U.S., but it's created kind of a lot of chaos. And we've been trying to do this for 20 years, and we still have major interagency operation issues. On the other hand, right, so that's our intelligence silo. On the defense silo, right, we see, right, the Department of Defense headed up by its Joint Chiefs of Staff, right, and it has 5 major armed forces, right. There's the Army, they love to fight on the ground. There's the Navy, they fight in the oceans, on the seas. There's the Air Force, right, in charge of the air. There's the Marines, who are, right, ground pounders, but they ride on boats. And then there's the Coast Guard, right, who protect our coast, right, help stranded boaters, do a lot of drug enforcement sort of things as well. So, right, these 5 branches work together to achieve the overall goals as stated by the executive officer, right, by the President of the United States, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Now, something interesting about our armed forces is that they are actually an all-volunteer force. Right? After the Vietnam War, we shifted from what we call a conscription army, where we forced people to serve, to one where, where our soldiers volunteer to join up. And that creates a kind of a fundamental shift in how a military operates. Right? It goes from being, we got to take these guys and just kind of put them into the meat grinder, to we're going to spend a lot of money and capital creating professional fighters here. Right? So this really, right, by essentially allowing, right, people to specialize in war fighting, this really allows our military to do a lot more specialized sorts of things, to be much more efficient in the way it fights, because you don't have to, right, deal with people who really don't want to be there, right? They have volunteered to fight, so they are now, right, part of this military. We also see some interesting relationships between Congress and the executive in how, right, force can be applied and what actually is a use of military force. Right, the AUMF, the Authorization of for the Use of Military Force, as part of the War Powers Act, states that the president can wield the military for about 90 days without true congressional approval. But that really has created a lot of interesting things into what actually constitutes a military action at this point, right? We've moved towards things like kinetic military actions that aren't, right, perhaps military force, right? So we've started to blur the lines about the actual usage of our military. But our military is, right, the strongest, most powerful military entity to ever walk the face of the earth. They're more technologically advanced. They're very good at what they do, but not necessarily, right? But what they do isn't necessarily what they're meant to do. And that creates some sort of issues. If you'd like to know more about that, please take the International Relations course or the Terrorism course that are offered here later on. So we have the silo of defense, right? And we also have the silo of diplomacy. And this is, generally speaking, our State Department that's taking the lead here. Now, our State Department is divided into 2 separate entities as well. Right? It has the D.C. portion of our State Department, which is, right, in Washington, D.C. It's in Foggy Bottom, right, that neighborhood. And it is responsible, right, this is where the Secretary of State does their job. Right? The D.C. office is responsible for things like setting policy for the State Department, right, dealing with the president, receiving foreign diplomats, right, so dealing with other people's ambassadors, as well as issuing passports. If you look at your passport, the Secretary of State vouches specifically for you. So that's a big portion of what the DC office does. On the other hand, right, the Foreign Service is about going out into the rest of the world. Right, this is where we send out our ambassadors, right, to our embassies to help enact our policies in the rest of the world. Right, it also does what we call consular services. Right, our U.S. consulates throughout the rest of the world. Right, so if you're traveling and something bad happens, you can go to the consulate and they will do what they can to help you out as an American citizen. You go, you show them your passport, and like, hey, welcome home. Let's deal with these problems. So really, our foreign policy apparatus is divided into kind of a defense silo and a diplomacy silo. We kind of inherently understand how defense works, right? They go, they break stuff, they kill people, right? They do some other things, but that's kind of at the core of their mission, right? That's very much hard power force. Now, the soft power side of things, diplomacy is a little bit more of a complicated issue. So we're going to wrap up by looking at how diplomacy works. So our diplomacy and the very idea of diplomacy is really heavily predicated on the use of soft power and our influence, right? Using our culture, using our economy, using our persuasive ability to make deals in the international system. But this is really kind of a two-level game, right? We have what's going on in public versus what actually goes on in private. And we can use these two different realities to push forward our diplomatic endeavors. I'm going to introduce a term. Some of you might be familiar with it, some of you might not be, but it's called kayfabe, right? And kayfabe is this notion of a fiction that everyone agrees to hold on to protect. It's a narrative about how reality plays out that might not actually be, right, the truth of the situation. Great example of this in the foreign policy realm. Right, the kayfabe of the situation is that the U.S. and North Korea are not dealing with each other, that we are attempting to play hardball with North Korea, while in reality, behind the scenes, we might be attempting to negotiate the end of their nuclear program, the ability for them to, right, reduce sanctions. So the president might be a very belligerent person in public, but behind the scenes, he has his diplomats, right, working the system, working with North Koreans and Chinese and South Koreans and the Japanese to rethink the relationship, right, between North Korea and the rest of the world. But the public narrative is all about that belligerence and how it drives them to the negotiating table. When in reality, that's used as essentially a tool to further the real behind the scenes work. Now, at the end of the day, we really have two major tools that we can use in our diplomatic dealings, right? And one's right, really kind of the carrot, and the other one's the stick. Right? I give you something, or I beat you. So on the positive side, on the giving, right, the giving things side, we have foreign aid. And this is really when the United States gives foreign actors money so that we can get them to do what we want them to do. Right? This is, hey, we'll pay you, and then you're going to do what we ask you to do. Right? We're going to ask you to do something, and we're going to give you money for it. Right? That's a fairly normal economic exchange. We'll pump up your economy. We'll buy more of your stuff. We'll just directly give you money to do what we want you to do. On the other hand, what we see is, right, kind of the forced way of doing things are economic situations, right? Economic sanctions, right? This is when we can say, we're not going to trade with you. We're going to make you we're going to make sure none of our friends trade with you. We're going to make you pay, right, money in the international system, right? We're going to put the squeeze on you until you do what we want you to do. So, right, we'll pay you, right? On the one hand, we can pay you to do stuff. On the other hand, we will beat you until you do exactly what we want you to do. Right, so really, right, it's about using our influence, right? Right, foreign aid giving is perhaps a little bit more effective than economic sanctions. There's some evidence that the carrot's a little bit better than the stick in this case. But really, that's how we play out diplomacy, right? We create a narrative of how the world works, and then we have these tools that we can use to get what we want out of the system. So that's really it, right? That's that's in large part how we do foreign policy in the United States. That's how we relate to the rest of the world. And that's really just a teaser of what's going on, right? We could spend an entire course on this. And right, that course is on offer, the International Relations course. It's available. It's out there. Please feel free to register for it. I look forward to working with you on that course as well. But that's going to do it for us for right now. So make sure you finish your assignments. Then, right, the next thing we'll have coming up after you finish your assignment, right, your reaction paper and your quiz here is we're going to have a final exam. So that's pretty much going to do it. So I want to say thank you. It's been a pleasure, and good luck. Have a great day.